There is a point in the Arabian Sea, roughly 250 kilometers from the nearest coastline of mainland Yemen, and further still from the Horn of Africa, where the water changes color and the current begins to carry a different kind of debris: driftwood, frankincense husks, the occasional seed pod from a tree that grows nowhere else on Earth. Sailors who have never set foot on the island say they can smell it before they see it. Something resinous, mineral, faintly sweet, riding on the wind ahead of the land itself. The land, when it appears, does not look like an island so much as a fragment of another planet that drifted into the wrong ocean. Granite peaks rise in jagged columns above a limestone plateau. Canyons cut deep red gashes into pale rock. And scattered across the high ground, in numbers that seem to increase the longer one looks, stand trees shaped like inverted umbrellas, dense green canopies balanced on thick gray trunks, as if drawn by someone who had only ever heard trees described and never seen one. This is Socotra. For scientists, it is one of the most botanically distinct places on the planet, a living catalog of species found in no other forest, desert, or reef on Earth. For sailors moving between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, it was for centuries a landmark and a warning, a place to note on the chart and, depending on the season, a place to avoid. For the roughly 60,000 people who call it home today, it is simply where they are from, an archipelago of 4 islands anchored between 2 continents and claimed fully by neither. Isolation is not a metaphor here. It is a measurable fact, written into the rock, the biology, and the language of the people. Socotra separated from the African-Arabian landmass long before the first flowering plants existed in their modern forms, and it has spent the millions of years since developing in near total solitude. Roughly a third of its plant species exist nowhere else. Its language, Socotri, has no written alphabet and shares only a distant root with Arabic. Its people speak of the island's spirits, its trees, and its seasons in stories carried by memory rather than by page. What follows moves through that isolation: geological, botanical, human, one region at a time. From the wind-cut plateau of Dixam to the salt flats of the eastern coast, from the caves of the Haggeher Massif to the ports where frankincense once left for Rome, the island tells its history less through monuments than through the shapes of the things that were allowed to grow undisturbed for a very long time. To understand why Socotra looks the way it does, it helps to go back further than any human record can reach. The island was once joined to the supercontinent of Gondwana, part of a single landmass that included what would eventually separate into Africa, Arabia, India, and Madagascar. As that ancient continent tore itself apart over tens of millions of years, a sliver of crust broke free along the edge of the Arabian Peninsula. That sliver became Socotra. Geologists still debate the exact timeline, but the working consensus places the island's final separation from the mainland somewhere between 6 and 18 million years ago, likely tied to the same rifting that opened the Gulf of Aden. Whatever the precise figure, the outcome is not in dispute. Socotra has spent an immense stretch of geological time as its own closed system, evolving in isolation, while continents around it kept moving. The rock itself tells a layered story. At the base sits ancient granite and metamorphic basement rock, some of the oldest exposed stone in the region, dating back over 500 million years. On top of that lies a thick cap of limestone, laid down when the area was submerged beneath a shallow sea, and built, layer by layer, from the compressed shells of marine organisms. Wind and rare but violent rainfall have spent the millennia since carving that limestone into the plateaus, sinkholes, and canyon systems that define the island's interior today, nowhere more dramatically than at Dixam, where the land opens into a shallow bowl of eroded stone stretching toward the horizon. Isolation, on a landmass this size, does something specific to the living things trapped within it. Species arrive rarely, carried by storm winds, ocean currents, or the occasional bird. And once they land, they evolve with almost no outside competition and no predators to check their spread. Over enough time, this produces the phenomenon biologists call island endemism. plants and animals that exist in a form found absolutely nowhere else, because there has been nowhere else for them to be shaped by. Socotra ranks among the most extreme examples of this process anywhere on the planet, sometimes described alongside the Galapagos and Madagascar as one of the world's great living laboratories of isolated evolution. The most visible proof of that isolation waits on the high plateau, in a shape unlike any tree found on any continent. The road to Dixam climbs slowly, switching back along limestone cliffs until the vegetation on either side stops looking like anything from a familiar climate zone. Above roughly 300 meters, the dragon's blood trees begin to appear, first scattered, then in dense stands that cover entire hillsides, their canopies fused together into an unbroken gray-green ceiling. Dracaena cinnabari, the dragon's blood tree, is the island's most recognizable resident and its most widely used symbol, appearing on tourism posters and scientific papers alike. Its shape is the product of a specific survival strategy. Instead of spreading leaves outward the way most trees do, it grows a tight, umbrella-like crown of branches that shades the trunk and root system beneath it, reducing evaporation in an environment where rain can be scarce for months at a stretch. The dense canopy also funnels the island's fog and rare rainfall down toward the roots, effectively building its own private irrigation system out of its own silhouette. The tree earns its name from the dark red resin that seeps out when the bark is cut, a substance historically prized as a dye, a varnish, and a folk remedy across the ancient world. Traders described it, sold it, and occasionally invented origin myths for it. One Mediterranean legend held that it was the blood of a dragon slain in combat with an elephant, congealed where it fell. The real explanation is less dramatic, but no less remarkable. An isolated species, producing a chemically unusual resin, in a forest type that survives almost nowhere else on the planet in this concentration. That survival is not guaranteed. Researchers monitoring the dragon's blood forests over the past several decades have documented a troubling pattern: healthy adult trees, but very few young saplings surviving to maturity. Grazing livestock, introduced generations ago, and now numbering in the tens of thousands across the island, eat the seedlings before they can establish deep enough roots to withstand the dry season. Combined with a changing rainfall pattern, this has raised concern among conservationists that the forests visible today, though they look ancient and permanent, may be an aging population with an uncertain next generation behind them. Below the dragon's blood canopy, the plateau floor holds its own quieter residents: succulents, endemic grasses, and small pockets of soil dark with centuries of leaf litter, evidence of a forest that has been rebuilding itself, slowly and without interruption, for longer than any written record of the island reaches back. West of Dixam, the plateau drops toward a different kind of landscape entirely. Around Home Hill, sun-bleached limestone karst opens into natural rock pools and narrow slot canyons, and the vegetation shifts from dense dragon's blood stands to something sparser and stranger. Here grows Adenium socotranum, the Socotra desert rose, a squat, bulbous-trunked tree that stores water in its swollen base and produces clusters of bright pink flowers against gray, almost stone-like bark. Its silhouette has been compared to a bottle, a boulder, and a bonsai, grown to the scale of a small building. None of the comparisons quite capture it, because nothing quite like it exists anywhere else. Further along the same limestone terrain stands an even odder relative, Dendrosaceae socotranus, the cucumber tree, the only member of the cucumber and melon family on Earth that has evolved into true tree form. Its trunk is thick, pale, and faintly swollen, more closely resembling a vegetable stem magnified 100-fold than conventional bark and wood. Botanists studying the island's flora have long pointed to it as one of the clearest single examples of Socotra's evolutionary isolation, a plant family that, everywhere else on the planet, stayed low to the ground, here reaching upward into something that, from a distance, could be mistaken for a small, gnarled tree. The coastline completes the range of extremes. At Qalansiyah, in the island's northwest, white dunes rise directly against a turquoise lagoon, with the Haggeher Mountains visible as a jagged blue line on the horizon behind them. three distinct landscapes visible in a single unbroken view. Along the eastern shore, near the town of Hadibu, mangrove stands cling to brackish tidal flats, sheltering juvenile fish and providing one of the only sources of shade for migrating shorebirds crossing between Africa and Asia. The surrounding waters carry their own concentration of endemic life. Reef surveys around the archipelago have recorded a striking mix of species drawn from both the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, along with a smaller number of fish and invertebrates found nowhere else, a marine echo of the isolation visible on land. Together, the desert interior, the mountain silhouette, and the reef-fringed coast make Socotra less a single ecosystem than a compressed sample of several, folded into an island roughly the size of a mid-sized American county. The Haggeher Massif, also written Haggeher in some transliterations, dominates the island's interior, its granite peaks reaching just over 1,500 meters and catching enough moisture from passing clouds to support a cooler, greener pocket of vegetation than almost anywhere else on Socotra. Mist collects in its upper valleys most mornings, feeding small permanent springs that have made the mountain slopes livable for people in a way the drier lowlands are not. It is here, and in the limestone cave systems that riddle the plateau below it, that the island's human story is most visible. Archaeological surveys have documented inscriptions in several ancient scripts carved into cave walls across the interior, left by traders, travelers, and possibly religious pilgrims passing through over roughly 2,000 years, alongside older pottery fragments suggesting human presence on the island considerably further back than the written record can confirm with precision. Some caves show signs of long-term habitation. Others appear to have served as waypoints, shelters used briefly by people moving between the coast and the highlands with their herds. Those herding patterns continue today. Many Socotri families still practice a seasonal rhythm shaped directly by the mountain's geography, moving goats and, in some households, cattle between lowland grazing near the coast during cooler months and higher pasture on the Haggeher slopes when the lowlands dry out. Cave shelters, some of them the same ones marked with centuries-old inscriptions, are still used by herders today as temporary housing during these seasonal movements, a rare case of a landscape's use pattern remaining essentially unbroken across an enormous span of time. The people themselves speak Socotra, a modern South Arabian language related distantly to Arabic but not mutually intelligible with it, and, crucially, never historically reduced to a standard written script. For most of its history, Socotri has been carried entirely through speech, in genealogies recited from memory, in a rich oral poetry tradition covering everything from love and loss to detailed botanical and navigational knowledge, and in an enormous vocabulary for describing local plants, weather patterns, and coastal features that outside linguists have found difficult to fully translate. Efforts to develop a written form of the language have gained ground only in recent decades, driven partly by concern that increased connection to the mainland and the spread of Arabic language schooling could accelerate the loss of a language with no book, in the traditional sense, to preserve it. What held the Socotri-speaking world together for so long without writing was not isolation from ideas, but a specific relationship to memory. Genealogy, natural knowledge, and history were treated as living material, updated and recited generation to generation, carried by people rather than by page. That same oral tradition remembers, still, the routes that connected this remote mountain to ports the ancient world considered essential. Long before any European chart marked its coordinates, Socotra was known to Mediterranean and Indian Ocean traders by name. The Periplus of the Arabian Sea, a Greek merchant's guide to Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade routes, written in roughly the 1st century CE, describes an island called Dioscurida, widely identified by historians with Socotra, noting its remoteness, its production of prized goods, and its role as a stopping point on the sea lanes linking Egypt, Arabia, and India. What made the island worth the detour was not fertile land or a sheltered harbor alone, but its exports. Dragon's blood resin traveled from Socotra into the wider ancient world as a dye and a medicinal ingredient. Aloe, extracted from several species growing wild across the plateau, was harvested and traded as a valued remedy, referenced in classical medical texts circulating around the Mediterranean. And frankincense and myrrh, though more commonly associated with the mainland Arabian and Horn of Africa coasts, directly across the water, moved through the same regional trade network that Socotra sat within, connecting the island's economy to a resin trade that supplied temples, embalmers, and physicians from Rome to the Arabian courts. Ownership of the island shifted with the trade winds and the ambitions of whoever controlled the surrounding sea lanes. Sources describe periods of rule connected to the Mahra people of the nearby Arabian mainland, whose sultanate would maintain a claim over Socotra for centuries, alongside earlier and looser periods of influence from various regional powers, with an interest in controlling the sea route between the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea. Christian communities are recorded on the island in antiquity as well, reportedly connected to early missionary activity, linked to Christian traditions in South Asia, one of several religious threads historians have traced through Socotra's early history before Islam became established there. None of these outside powers, however, appear to have settled the island's interior in significant numbers or displaced its existing population and language. Socotra's remoteness, the same quality that made it dangerous to reach by sea for parts of the year, seems to have limited outside control to coastal footholds and periodic tribute rather than full occupation. The resin left. The traders who came for it mostly did not stay. What remained, generation after generation, was a Socotri-speaking population governing its own interior while distant empires took note of the island, primarily as a name on a trade ledger. That pattern, visited, valued, rarely occupied, would eventually draw a different kind of attention, backed by a different kind of power. In the early 16th century, Portuguese ships arrived in the Indian Ocean, determined to control the sea routes that carried spices, textiles, and resin between Asia, Africa, and Europe. Socotra's position near the mouth of the Gulf of Aden made it strategically attractive as a potential base for monitoring and interrupting Arab and Indian shipping bound for the Red Sea. Portuguese forces occupied the island briefly in the early 1500s, reportedly drawn in part by rumors, later found to be unfounded, of a surviving Christian population that could serve as an ally against Muslim powers in the region. The occupation did not last. Portuguese accounts describe a difficult, resource-poor posting, with supply lines stretched thin and little in the way of the material wealth their commanders had hoped to extract. Within a matter of years, Portuguese forces withdrew, and the island reverted to the control of the Mahra Sultanate, the same Arabian mainland dynasty that had held sway over Socotra prior to the brief European interruption. For nearly 4 centuries afterward, the Mahra Sultans would remain the island's recognized rulers, governing largely through local structures rather than direct outside administration. That arrangement changed again in the latter half of the 19th century, as Britain expanded its network of protectorates and coaling stations along the routes connecting the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal after its 1869 opening to British India. In 1886, the Sultan of the Mahra entered into a treaty relationship with Britain, and Socotra came to be administered as part of the Aden Protectorate, the wider British sphere of influence over South Arabia. British interest in the island was primarily strategic, tied to its position along the sea lane to India, rather than an attempt at large-scale settlement or economic development, and day-to-day governance of the interior remained substantially in local hands throughout the Protectorate period. Physical traces of these successive outside interests are sparse. Unlike Aden itself, which British administration transformed into a major coaling port and garrison town, Socotra saw comparatively little colonial infrastructure, no large fortifications, no significant transplanted population, only a handful of coastal way stations, and the ongoing, quieter presence of Mahra authority inland. The island's remoteness, which had shaped its biology for millions of years, shaped its colonial history as well. Valuable enough to claim on a map, difficult enough to discourage anyone from staying. That distant relationship with faraway capitals would soon be tested by a much closer set of political changes on the Arabian mainland itself. British withdrawal from South Arabia in 1967 ended the protectorate system and gave rise to the People's Republic of South Yemen, which the following year adopted a Marxist government and was renamed the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. Socotra, along with the rest of the former Mahra territories, became part of this new socialist state, administered from the mainland capital of Aden, hundreds of kilometers across open water. For the island, the practical change was gradual rather than sudden. South Yemen's government established a small military and administrative presence, and Soviet-aligned South Yemen reportedly viewed Socotra's location as strategically useful during the Cold War, though large-scale military development on the island itself remained limited. For most residents, daily life continued to be shaped far more by seasonal monsoon winds, herding cycles, and the difficulty of reaching the mainland than by decisions made in Aden or, by extension, Moscow. That distant governance became more distant still in 1990, when North and South Yemen unified into a single Republic of Yemen following years of negotiation and, at times, tension between the two states. Socotra was absorbed into the unified country's Hadramaut Governorate and later organized as its own governorate in the 2000s, but the underlying geography did not change. The island remained separated from the seat of national government by a stretch of open sea that limited transport largely to a handful of flights and slow ferry crossings, dependent on weather that could cancel both without much warning. This persistent physical isolation shaped how modernization reached Socotra. Paved roads, reliable electricity, and expanded schooling arrived on the island later and more unevenly than in mainland Yemeni cities, and for much of the population, subsistence fishing and livestock herding remained the practical backbone of daily life well into the 21st century, continuing patterns with roots stretching back centuries rather than decades. The island had changed flags several times since the departure of the Mahra sultans, but the fundamental fact that had shaped its biology and its culture, its distance from anywhere else, continued to shape its politics and its economy as well. Then, in a span of just over a week in November 2015, a different kind of force would arrive from the sea, one that owed nothing to any government at all. Tropical cyclones almost never reach Socotra. The Arabian Sea produces them, but most curve north toward the Gulf of Oman or India, or weaken well before reaching the island's latitude. In November 2015, that pattern broke twice within the same 9-day stretch. Cyclone Chapala made landfall near the island on November 3, 2015, as an unusually powerful storm for the region, bringing destructive winds and, more consequentially, rainfall totals that in some areas reportedly exceeded what the island would ordinarily expect across several years combined. Flash floods tore through wadis that are normally dry stream channels, damaging roads, homes, and boats, and disrupting the fishing and herding activity that much of the population depended on directly. Before recovery efforts had gone far, a second storm followed. Cyclone Meg struck the island on November 10th, compounding the damage from Chapala, with additional wind and flooding, just as residents and limited local authorities were beginning to assess the first storm's toll. The back-to-back nature of the two cyclones, a sequence meteorologists described as extraordinarily rare for this part of the Arabian Sea, left infrastructure, already limited by the island's remoteness, badly strained, with reports of destroyed fishing boats, damaged water systems, and thousands of residents affected across the island's coastal and interior communities. International and regional relief response reached the island in the weeks that followed, though logistics were complicated by Socotra's isolation and by the wider instability then unfolding on the Yemeni mainland, where a civil war had begun earlier the same year. The dragon's blood forests and other endemic vegetation, adapted over millions of years to the region's normal dry conditions and rare, brief rains, also experienced physical damage from the storm's intensity, according to observations from researchers and conservationists monitoring the island's ecosystems, adding an ecological dimension to a disaster that was, in its immediate impact, primarily humanitarian. The double cyclone remains, in the living memory of Socotra's residents, one of the defining events of the past decade, a stark reminder that an island shaped over geological time by isolation and by rare, irregular weather is not exempt from that same weather turning catastrophic within the span of little more than a week. Recovery was still underway when a different kind of disruption, this one entirely of human origin, arrived from across the water. The civil war that began on the Yemeni mainland in 2014 and 2015, pitting the internationally recognized government against Houthi forces and drawing in a Saudi-led military coalition, unfolded largely at a distance from Socotra itself. The island saw none of the direct frontline fighting that devastated cities like Taiz, Sana'a, or Aden. But distance from the fighting did not mean distance from its consequences. As the war strained Yemen's national government and its ability to administer remote territories, outside actors took on a larger role in Socotra's affairs. The United Arab Emirates, a member of the Saudi-led coalition, established a growing presence on the island, beginning around 2018, reportedly including humanitarian and infrastructure assistance, alongside a military footprint that drew significant international attention and, at times, friction with Yemen's internationally recognized government. Reports from journalists and regional analysts described tensions in 2018 when forces reportedly aligned with the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council took control of Socotra's airport and other facilities, prompting formal objections from Yemeni officials and concern from other governments involved in the broader conflict, before a subsequent agreement eased the immediate standoff. The details of the UAE's objectives on Socotra have been the subject of ongoing debate among analysts, with explanations ranging from counterterrorism and regional security concerns to interest in the island's strategic maritime position near vital shipping lanes, and, according to some reporting, interest in developing tourism infrastructure and other investment. Yemeni officials and some island residents have expressed concern over the extent of outside influence on local governance and land use, while others on the island have pointed to tangible benefits, including humanitarian aid, medical support, and infrastructure improvements, delivered during a period when the internationally recognized central government had limited capacity to provide them. The situation remains, as of recent reporting, a subject of continued diplomatic sensitivity between Yemen and the UAE, within the wider and still unresolved framework of the broader Yemeni civil war. For Socotra residents, the practical experience of these years has varied by community and circumstance, encompassing both the disruption of increased militarization and outside political maneuvering, and, for some, improved access to services during a period of acute national crisis. What is not in dispute is that an island whose defining historical trait has been its remoteness from outside power found itself, over the past decade, unusually exposed to it, pulled into the strategic calculations of a war being fought, for the most part, hundreds of kilometers away. Amid the political uncertainty, the deeper and slower question facing Socotra has remained constant: whether the ecosystems that make the island singular can be protected regardless of who governs it. In July 2008, UNESCO inscribed the Socotra archipelago on its World Heritage List, recognizing it as a site of outstanding universal value for its biodiversity and its exceptional concentration of endemic species. The designation covers not just the main island, but the surrounding smaller islands of Abd al-Khuri, Samha, and Darsa, along with the marine environment that connects them, formally acknowledging what botanists and marine biologists had documented for decades, that this single archipelago, roughly the size of a small American state, holds a density of unique plant and animal life rarely matched anywhere else on the planet. The recognition arrived alongside a set of pressures that make protecting that biodiversity considerably more complicated than declaring it valuable. Grazing by introduced goats, sheep, and cattle, now numbering in the tens of thousands across the island, remains one of the most immediate threats to the dragon's blood forests and other native vegetation, preventing young trees and shrubs from surviving past their most vulnerable early years. Researchers monitoring the forests have found that in many areas, The visible tree cover is aging without adequate replacement, a slow-motion demographic problem that will not become fully apparent for another generation or two, by which point reversing it would be far harder. Climate patterns add a second layer of pressure. The back-to-back cyclones of 2015 demonstrated that Socotra's weather, historically characterized by predictable monsoon winds and rare rainfall, is not immune to the kind of extreme, low-probability events that climate scientists have linked to broader shifts in Indian Ocean storm patterns. Vegetation adapted over millions of years to slow, incremental environmental change faces a harder test when that change arrives instead in sudden, violent bursts. Coastal erosion, shifting rainfall timing, and rising sea temperatures affecting the surrounding reef systems round out a set of environmental challenges that conservation planning on the island has only begun to fully address. Political instability compounds both problems. Yemen's ongoing civil war has limited the national government's capacity to fund and enforce conservation measures, even where local and international conservation organizations have worked to fill gaps through direct engagement with island communities. Increased outside investment and infrastructure development, whatever its source, carries the same double edge it does in many biodiversity hotspots worldwide. The roads, airports, and facilities that improve residents' access to healthcare, education, and markets are frequently the same infrastructure that increases pressure on fragile habitat, by making the island easier to reach, easier to develop, and harder to keep undisturbed. Conservation efforts on the ground have not been absent. Local and international organizations have supported fenced nursery plots designed to let dragon's blood saplings grow past the height where grazing animals can reach them, a low-technology intervention aimed directly at the forest's most documented vulnerability. Community-based initiatives have worked with Socotra herders on grazing management approaches intended to balance traditional livestock practices against forest regeneration needs, an effort that depends on cooperation with the same pastoral communities whose herds are part of the pressure in the first place. Documentation projects have also worked to record Socotra oral literature and vocabulary before further generational change accelerates language loss, treating the island's linguistic heritage as a form of biodiversity in its own right, no less irreplaceable than an endemic tree. None of these efforts offers a guaranteed outcome. What they share is a recognition that Socotra's defining quality, its long isolation from the rest of the world, was never a permanent condition, only a temporary one that outside forces have chipped away at with increasing speed over the past century and a half. Colonial interest, national governments, a changing climate, a civil war, and now a growing stream of visitors drawn by the island's own reputation for remoteness. The tension is not new, but it has rarely been sharper than it is today. Access is what allows aid, medicine, and economic opportunity to reach island communities. Access is also, on an island shaped by isolation, more thoroughly than almost anywhere else on Earth, one of the clearest threats to the very thing that makes it worth protecting. At dusk on the Dixam plateau, when the wind drops and the light turns the limestone the color of dried blood, the dragon's blood trees stand exactly as they have for centuries, their canopies closed like umbrellas against a rain that, this evening, does not come. Below them, a herder moves his goats toward a cave his grandfather likely used for the same purpose, in a language that has no written form and, for now, needs none to carry what matters. Whether that scene continues largely unchanged or becomes something remembered rather than lived will not be decided by the island's geology, which has already done its work over millions of patient years. It will be decided by what the rest of the world, having finally found its way to Socotra, chooses to do with what it found.